Welcome to the Runners World podcast with me, Rick Pearson.
And me, Ben Hobson.
This week we're speaking with author and trail runner Rachel Hewitt about her new book, In Her Nature, How Women Break Boundaries in the Great Outdoors.
This one was an education for me, Rick.
Oh, I'm glad.
Certainly a few elements of it, which I don't know why I'm surprised, but talking to Rachel afterwards and sort of saying like, oh, it was amazing when when you broke it down like that, and how the sort of the establishment of different sporting leagues or whatever was intrinsically tied with the suppression of women like out of the sport. It's obviously something that maybe has come up in the past, but it was very interesting to hear Rachel break it down in a bigger picture. And I think that was so. Hopefully, similarly, for anyone listening, it's very interesting what our discussion that we had with her.
Yeah, it's great,
as you'd imagine from a talented author like herself. But
exactly.
It was really good.
How is your own running, Ben? You've been on riding a wave. People are saying.
And waves come crashing down. No, everything's fine. I've got a small, sort of tight hip. Which I've actually been pretty diligent with. Sought help immediately from a friend of the podcast, Gareth Cole, who's been on before to talk about all things biomechanical. And he had a quick look and said that just got a bit of just tightness, which is fine. So guess what? The old foam roller's out, and I got the foam rollers out and a very hard, I'd say probably like a lacrosse ball, perhaps that sort of thing. I'm just doing some of that stuff, which, I mean, anyone listening will be ultimately familiar with the perils of having to deal with all of that sort of stuff. So you're sort of taking up valuable floor space in the house as I sort of roll around and groan and make
writhing around
while everyone looks on thinking, God, this guy needs to get a life. This is absolutely outrageous. So yeah, that's about it.
And it's all roads leading to the Hackney Half, is that right?
I mean, hopefully that's the idea. I mean,
great.
That's the next one on the list. Hackney, I ran the first ever version of it however many years ago.
Oh, mate, wow.
And then since then, I haven't been back. It's the roads where I used to live, so I'm always happy to go and run around there. It's nice. Yeah. How's your running?
Mate, it's good. I'm refamiliarising myself with painful running.
Oh, good. Not painful bad running, but painful exertion running.
Let's call it like challenging running. I think like when you're, as I have, I guess part of it's been like recovering from injuries and stuff, but really I've kind of ducked away from challenging training, and I've enjoyed it, and I've had other stresses in my life, as in becoming a dad for the second time. But I'm jumping back in. I'm targeting a 10 miler, probably the Cabbage Patch 10 in October, and I want to try and really piece together like 4 or 5 months of quality training. I have to do it smart. I'm not going to put in huge miles and things like that, but I'm getting back on the horse. And actually, running quickly is actually really exhilarating, isn't it? That's a bit that gets lost in your memory. You always think, oh God, you have to do some 6-minute mile reps here or whatever, and it's like, but actually you feel brilliant afterwards. So like that's a bit that gets lost. It's quite exhilarating, I think. So it's been nice to remind myself.
I think there's sort of always that the memory always tends to exist around a sustained effort, and that can be horrible when actually if you break it down into intervals,
yes,
they're exhilarating because you get that sort of surge of like effort, but you know it's going to finish, and it does, and you can recover and you have to do it again. And it's not nice, obviously doing intervals is hard work, but it's not sort of continuous, so you can kind of, it ebbs and flows, and you can
get through it. Get through it. Exactly.
Oh my God, that sounds great, mate. So we're calling it now, yeah, sub 60 for that 10 miler.
Oh, mate, that would be if everything goes really, really well. That'd be like if everything's perfect, that would be the goal. But in some ways, that's like it's a proper challenge in the sense that the chances of failure are relatively high with it.
Yeah, I think. That's we've had enough people on this podcast tell us that we've got to have sort of what seem like mildly unachievable aims as the main thing to go for. So I think that's very achievable for you, though. To be honest,
I think that's I have been inspired by some people we chat to who are prepared to. Yeah, push themselves to their limit and also to fail occasionally in the kind of because that's how your progress is made. And I think that I've probably had a few soft goals of running over the last few years where I'm like, oh, as long as I get under this, I'll be happy. When the chances of it not happening were relatively slim, whereas this one would be like, I'll give you about 50-50.
Nice.
which is good, right? Yeah.
50-50 now is great because, but after some of this more training, you're going to be way more like 70-30. I
don't know, mate. We'll have to see. But anyway, no, it's exciting to be focusing on something again. I think that's important. Anyway, should we stop waffling on and we'll get our guest of the week on?
More important than anything. Yep.
Guest of the week. Here in the studio. Guest of the week. Sometimes on the phone. Could be an athlete. Could be a physio or a complete unknown.
This week, we're speaking with author and trail runner Rachel Hewitt about her new book, In Her Nature, which celebrates the often overlooked achievements of women in the great outdoors. So, Rachel, welcome to the Runner's World podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Can we start then with why did you want to write In Her Nature?
Yeah, so I got into sort of long distance trail running really around 2017. And, I just fell in love with it, absolutely loved it, everything about it, and wanted to read as much as possible, really, about sort of other people's experiences of running, and especially running long distances. And, I went to numerous bookshops and went to the sports section and, the shelves were just full of books that had on their front cover a silhouette of a male runner, and the stories that were encased inside these books were also, I felt, mainly of kind of men's experiences of running, whether that's sort of experiences of races and kit, or just sort of experiences of, the joys and the benefits that running can bring. And I wanted to read something really that was, sort of tapping into the things that I was finding in running, the sort of, the way in which, I loved the fact that I could, after, I've got 3 children, and at that point, the kids were very young. And when I left the house, I was normally weighed down by like a massive double buggy and changing bag full of nappies and whatever. And, and I love the fact that in running, it was just me, me in leggings, and all I needed to take was a key, and I sort of wanted to read a bit more about those sorts of experiences that, kind of were quite specific really to kind of women running, and, and their sort of joys, but also, pitfalls as well. And, I was sort of increasingly aware of being on the receiving end of a fair bit of street harassment, from sort of catcalls up to men chasing me. And, again, I wanted to kind of read more about how that sort of sense of the outdoors as a potential place of danger was something that shaped women's experiences of running. So I sat down and wrote that book.
I mean, it's very interesting. I think as well, a lot of those books, I imagine that you were coming across are very centered around racing as well. And it's all about that sort of a sense of achievement, being goal driven from a must finish in X number of hours or a start. Whereas that's obviously not the journey that a lot of people get into running.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was quite wary of that. I think running can really suit a particular mindset that revolves a bit around quantification, and I was finding myself doing a lot of mental arithmetic when I was running, sort of trying to work out what my pace was and what my finishing time was likely to be, and, my VO2 max, and sort of whether this was an improvement and all of that. And I sort of realized that actually this tapped into quite unhealthy personality traits that I had experienced, when I was a bit younger, and when I was very obsessed with sort of calorie intake and my weight. And, and I sort of realized that running was, tapping into some of those same sort of dynamics. So actually I wanted to kind of find a way to run that wasn't necessarily about improvement, actually, that was really about, it sort of struck me that there are things that I do in my day-to-day life that bring me quite a lot of pleasure, like sort of, like putting a nice cleanser on my face at the end of the day or whatever. But I don't expect to get better at those things. They're just a nice thing to have in your day. I don't measure that I'm like getting better at cleaning my face, and it sort of struck me actually like, maybe running could be like that it's a sort of daily joy or pleasure, but that joy isn't always about getting faster or fitter.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the characters in the book, particularly Lizzie LeBlond, which is just like an amazing name? And can you tell us about her sort of trailblazing life and her role in kind of being a pioneer of women in the outdoors?
Yeah, absolutely. She's so wildly glamorous. I think, part of what I wanted to do in this book is counter my sense that I felt a bit kind of not really at home in the kind of great outdoors, felt a bit like sports like sort of running, but also, long distance hiking, particularly ultra running. I think, it had a bit of a sort of macho image. And, I wanted to kind of counter my sense that I was a bit of an interloper in those sports by finding a history of women participating in sort of climbing or running or hiking up mountains. And at first, when I started looking for, this history, this sense that women have always been outdoors, I kept coming up against these claims that women had only started running in the 1970s, that women had only started mountaineering in the 1970s. And at first, I encountered this so much, in sort of in blogs, but also in kind of academic histories, which talked about how women's history of sport was really as spectators, not as participants. And at first I sort of, kind of accepted this and felt sad about it, but didn't really question it. And it was only after really a kind of couple of months that I started thinking, well, hang on, these kind of activities like running and climbing and walking, they're really basic forms of human motion. And I started realizing how ludicrous it was, the idea that women had only really been doing this for kind of 50 years. So I started digging deeper. And, that one of the first women whom I uncovered was this woman, Lizzie LeBlond. And she made such an impression on me because, she was a celebrity mountaineer, really kind of one of, the most famous elite sports people of the 1880s and 1890s. But as well as breaking all sorts of records in mountaineering, in ice skating, in tennis, she was also a kind of long distance cyclist, as well as all these kind of sporting records that she was breaking. She was also really intent on documenting her culture of women's sport in the 19th century through photography. And so that was, that her archive of photographs was just so eye-opening to me. Thousands and thousands of photographs of Victorian women, strong and sweaty and athletic and competitive. And it just totally, kind of blasted apart the stereotype that I had entertained of Victorian women. And I realized, I'd assumed that Victorian women were all sort of, angels in the house, right? They're all like pale and wan and sort of reclining on sofas and certainly not, sprinting up the Alps. So this really was such a jolt. And it, made me realize that the vision of the history of women's sport that I had been reading about was just like totally wrong.
Why do you think that there's this sort of, I don't know, why is it so unreported? Why do you think there's such a sort of vast sort of dearth in sort of like celebrated figures when there obviously were so many, as you found out and are in the book? Why is it not sort of more commonplace? Is it just the time actually those reporting on it, it was, I don't know, the reporting was so sort of here and there that there wasn't actually sort of like a solid base? And why has it sort of got to the stage now where it's only just people like yourself writing books who are unearthing these people?
I mean, yeah, that's such a key question. And I think, what's really startling is that, at the time that Lizzie LeBlond was famous, there was a lot of reporting of women's sport. Lizzie herself wrote something like, sort of 64 publications, in sort of languages that were translated kind of across the world. She was really, really famous. And, newspapers quite regularly included reports on women's sport. Lizzie herself was an editor of a newspaper in St. Moritz, and that had pretty much 50-50 coverage of men and women's sports. But I think, what I'm trying to identify is kind of like why has that been lost to public view? And something I sort of found was major in this sort of shift in history was that towards the sort of latter half of the 19th century, there is a move to sort of make sport more organized, to kind of codify it and to pin down its kind of rules and regulations, and that sport becomes more organized around particular facilities or particular competitions. And part of this kind of shift is ideological. It's to do with masculinity, and it's to do with the sort of function that sport is considered to have in kind of training up and organising young boys and men to be sort of adequate leaders of the empire, really. And so, you know, a lot of this sort of organisation of sport takes place in kind of public schools and in universities. And something that goes hand in hand with the organisation of sport is that kind of record keeping about, you know, particular achievements in sport or kind of particular experiences start revolving around these new clubs and facilities and publications that are being churned out by kind of universities or public schools. And, you know, a lot of those institutions are male dominated. You know, so what they're recording is actually sort of men's participation in competitions, men's record breaking, and that this is disseminated among a largely male readership. So it's not that women aren't participating in sport as this sort of transition is happening, but it's that their participation is no longer being granted the same sort of limelight as men's sport. And so when sort of people in the, you know, later half of the 20th century come to research the history of sport, obviously a lot of the material that is the most easily accessible is the sort of published lists of rules and regulations and participants and competitions and records that have been created by male-dominated clubs and male-dominated competitions and disseminated to a male readership. So, you know, it's quite easy then to see how the sort of women's achievements are sort of falling out of visibility.
What do you think the kind of the knock-on effect of that is, Rachel, when a history isn't documented as well as it should be? How does that make the modern female runner feel, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's enormous knock-on effects, and some of them are sort of psychological and emotional, and some of them are quite practical and logistic, you know. So I think on an emotional level, you know, this sort of sense that the outdoors is men's space, that, you know, women are kind of like interlopers into kind of men's space is really damaging. And, you know, when you look at sort of surveys for why a lot of women are sort of reluctant or sort of, you know, a bit scared really of taking part in, you know, particularly sports like ultra running and trail running. You know, lots of things that women report is, you know, as deterring them is lack of confidence, you know, and that confidence is both psychological and practical. So, you know, it's to do with kind of women historically having less training in skills like sort of navigation or kind of bushcraft, you know, but it's also just to do with this really deep-seated sense that actually the outdoors is a place of danger for many women, that it's a place that we haven't historically belonged, and that we're sort of fairly recent kind of entrance into that world. But, you know, that has sort of like knock-on effects in terms of, you know, the experiences that women have in like competitive events. You know, part of this sort of organisation of sport in the late 19th century was, you know, the sort of writing of the rules and regulations around competitions to facilitate male athletes. And, you know, at the crudest level, a lot of women were just barred from competitions. But it also has sort of knock-on effects, you know, I suppose in sort of my own sports, you know, like cutoffs are really important, right? You know, like that it's horrible to be doing as an ultra and feeling like you're constantly, you know, have cutoffs sort of nipping at your heels. But actually sort of, you know, cutoffs are largely designed around, you know, sort of male physiological abilities. You know, they're designed around sort of, you know, the sort of speed that it's considered sort of likely or reasonable for a male runner to complete a distance. And that women, you know, in running are generally about sort of 10 to 15% slower than men. So obviously a race that kind of boasts having particularly tough cutoffs for men are going to have almost impossible cutoffs for women, actually. And, you know, you can see this instantly by looking at, you know, the participation sheets for races and who signs up to them. You know, there's one particular ultra that boasts having kind of some of the most brutal cutoffs in Britain. And, you know, and they are pretty brutal for men. They're almost, you know, sort of unachievable for women. And so 4% of their participants are women. You know, so I think, you know, that sort of effect of that sort of misrepresentation of history as being sort of dominated by men in sport, yeah, it has those sort of practical effects on how women participate in sports day. And, you know, race directors might not always just sort of be alert to those questions, I think, of the fact that sort of competition has historically been designed around men.
No, we had Lauren Fleshman on, Olympian, and she, in her book that she wrote recently, and it brings up a lot of these issues, but in relation to the sort of early stages of athletic development being very much centered around a male, and physiological development of men, and obviously puberty and all those sorts of things, and how it's a completely different experience for women, and how the two sort of like the pressures that place on young women competing are sort of wholly unfair and unhealthy. And that's obviously just the legacy of what you're sort of talking about.
Yeah, and there's, huge shifts being made, kind of in the present day around sort of training being far more alert to women's specific physiology, and, sort of the fact that personal trainers and running coaches are now far more aware of the fact that, training schedules have to be designed differently at different points in the month around one's menstrual cycle. But, there's still a lot to be done. And I think, a particular area where there isn't really sort of sufficient research or advice is around menopause, actually, how sort of women need to train differently during menopause and after it. So there's a lot of work to be done. And, when you look at the sort of recent history of the inclusion of, sort of female subjects in sports science research, it's still pretty tiny. It's gone from something like 3% of subjects in sports science research being female, I think in about 2018, to maybe about 5% now. But, often, the excuse that sports science researchers give is that, women's hormonal variations make them too complicated to research. Yeah. But that's exactly why we need the research, because obviously training is going to be really different for a male body than a female body.
In the book, Rachel, you write, experiencing free movement and a sense of physical power makes me hungry for other forms of liberation and authority. I'm interested in how trail running can be a kind of arena for empowerment and self-improvement, and what you found there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I sort of came to running, I wasn't really looking for sort of a big feminist project or anything, right? I just wanted to kind of spend a bit more time outside and get fit. And I was really kind of stunned, I think, at the way in which the kind of skills and self-knowledge that I developed through running had knock-on effects in the rest of my life. So it's partly just to do with, like when you're running long distances, 50, 80 miles, you're going through a huge amount of sort of physical changes in the course of one day, and sort of experiences that I like, physical experiences that I had never had before. And so I got to know my body in a way, in sort of in its detail and its variations, in a way that I'd kind of never had an opportunity to do that before. Simple things really, like sort of what you fancy eating after 10 miles versus what you might fancy eating after 80 miles, but it's also something that's called kind of like self-care in trail running, I suppose, how you look after yourself. And yes, that is to do with looking after yourself on the trail, like in a run, how you sort of manage your feet, or how you deal with the fact that, like, your bra might be rubbing, that sort of thing, or just sort of making sure that you take on enough nutrition and sort of electrolytes, even if you don't really want to, but that's capacity for self-care, I think, is something that has ramifications outside of running. And that, clearly, if you want to be sort of fit enough to run, sort of 80, 100 miles, you have to look after yourself generally as well, and I think it's something that women aren't always encouraged to do, actually, to kind of prioritize their own sort of, physical and mental well-being. We're sort of so socialized into caring for other people. And obviously, as a sort of, I've got 3 children, and, I've got a lot of experience in sort of, caring for young children, but it wasn't really until I started running that I applied some of that knowledge to myself, But I sort of think, like running also gave me, sort of practical skills that I didn't have before, like my navigation's quite good now, and it's sort of, and I sort of got really good at it. It sounds a bit silly, but I used to be quite sort of bad at asking questions of people, like I was a bit sort of shy and felt like I was sort of intruding on their time, and that this was really knowledge that I should just have generally. And, and I think running just gave me this sort of confidence to be able to identify quite quickly what it was that I needed and wanted and how to ask for it, and those are kind of really fundamental things actually to sort of how you live your life in the world, and it's something that a lot of women I think aren't really sort of socialized into.
Do you think women are still being driven out of the outdoors, or do you think it's reaching some sort of leveling off of sort of accessibility and encouragement to be there? I mean, you've got, huge, important ultra running figureheads now, female figureheads who are winning races outright. So does that help in changing the whole landscape, or do you think that there's still sort of, that's fine to celebrate those women and their victories, but actually on a sort of more grassroots fundamental level, there's still a huge sort of disparity between access between men and women?
Yeah, so I mean, that was really one of the key things that I wanted to explore in this book, is whether we are living through a moment of kind of progress in women's sport or a period of backlash, and I ended up thinking, well, actually, we're living through both, So yes, on the one hand, we've got, a huge rise of participation in women in running. I think there's some in America, there's now more female recreational runners than men, which is just staggering considering that, when you look at the statistics from the 1970s, something like 95% men and 5% women. Now it's sort of in, some surveys suggest that, it's 58% of runners in the US are a female. And, that goes hand in hand with, the coming to the fore of these like truly remarkable female athletes, who are getting more visibility, who are these really important role models for women entering running today. And that also, all of that goes hand in hand with a sort of greater provision of like kit and equipment that's designed for women's bodies, training schedules that are, that there are more of them that are designed for like women's physiology. So in like lots of ways there, it's a period of, great optimism, I think. But, when I looked at surveys of kind of what deterred women from running, but also hiking, climbing, and just sort of like, being outdoors in general, when I first started researching this book, I thought that the big issues for women in sport were going to be quite technical ones, like ones about kits or about sort of race and competition regulations, or about club membership, these kind of quite sort of technical questions that have sort of actually quite quick fix solutions. So I suppose my hope was I might be able to sort of draw up some kind of like crib sheet, for sort of race directors of like, this is what you need to do to make your event more female friendly. But actually, what all the research suggests is that women are deterred from outdoor sport by fear, and by specifically fear of male violence. And, that this isn't just, all in our minds. It's not just some sort of imaginary thing that we've conjured up, that actually a huge number of women, I mean, it's, something like 99% of women, so it's basically all women really, have experienced some form of street harassment, and that ranges from just sort of simple catcalls or obscene noises, to being raped and murdered whilst they're outside, and that the experiences of female runners are, a microcosm of that, but they do show, I think, that male violence towards women outdoors is on the increase. And, if you look at the rates of attacks on female runners in, the last sort of 6-7 years, there's an exponential rise really for, sort of the decade compared to the decades before that. So it's something like, more women running have been murdered by men in the since 2016 than in the 28 years before that. There was a massive rise in street harassment during the pandemic. And a lot of that harassment and abuse and assault is targeted at teenage girls specifically. And, that's such a formative period for women. And it's already a period where girls are experiencing a massive drop-off in participation in sport. You know, it's up until about the age of sort of 8, 9, 10, you know, there's kind of roughly equal levels of participation between sort of primary age girls and boys in sport. And, you know, during teenagehood, like, girls just drop out of clubs and, you know, don't attain the World Health Organization recommendation for how many minutes of exercise they need to do per week. Whereas, you know, sort of boys' level of participation in sport continues to rise. And, you know, this sets a pattern for adulthood. And, you know, and a large part of that drop off in sport, you know, it is to do with other things, but a large part of it is to do with the experience of male harassment and derision when girls are participating in sport and when they're outside. And, you know, I don't have any quick fix solutions for that. You know, that is not a problem that is as easy to remedy as, you know, simply adjusting cutoffs in an ultra race.
Yeah, there's some shocking statistics there. What do you think that the modern female runner can learn from the heroes of the past? What did you learn by looking back and uncovering people like Lizzie LeBlond?
So I think there are positive messages, but I think there's also like a sort of warning signal, right? So the positive messages are that women belong in the great outdoors, you know, that this is provable, you know, that we have a history that is easily as long as men's history in the outdoors, you know, that we can look to women of over sort of 150 years ago and sort of, you know, much longer as well, who are sort of, you know, gaining, well, who have respect and visibility and are achieving, you know, really sort of extraordinary things in the great outdoors. But a warning sign, I think, is that a lot of these women writing in the 19th century about their experiences are actually writing about the same things that women experience today in terms of the factors that kind of hinder their engagement with outdoor sports. So, you know, I found it absolutely stunning, really, that, and not in a good way, you know, that women in the 19th century are writing about how being harassed on the street stops them from going for a walk. You know, there's the same kind of debates that are going on about abuse of women on public transport. These are you know, in the 1870s, people are debating about whether, you know, whose responsibility is it to deal with this? You know, should we design women only carriages for trains? You know, or like, and, you know, one journalist writes, well, you know, it's all well and good faffing around with women only carriages, but actually it's the whole structure of society that needs to change. And, you know, this is such a kind of contemporary debate that it's kind of stunning reading exactly that same debate in exactly the same language, you know, happening 150 years ago. So I think the sort of warning is that, you know, people like Lizzie LeBlond thought that they were living through a period of huge progress in women's rights in sport. And they were. But at the same time, you know, progress is often met with backlash. And often those things happen at the same time, you know, so at the same time that sort of women like Lizzie were forging ahead in sport, there were also men pushing back. And part of the way that they were pushing back was, you know, violence and harassment on the streets. And part of it was through appropriating organised sport to kind of to shape the rules and regulations around keeping women out. And that often those backlashes work. You know, and in the case of Lizzie LeBlond and her sort of generation of female sports people, it did work. You know, they have been written out of history. We've forgotten about them. So I think, you know, the warning really for sort of women today is don't assume that our rights are secure in sport, you know, that actually we need to defend our place in the outdoors constantly. You know, we need to be vigilant in the same way that we need to be vigilant of women's rights in legislation as well.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And when is the book out? Is it out now? How can people get it? What's the best thing to do?
It came out about 10 days ago, and you can get it from any good bookshop, really. Online or, you know, bookstores in person. And, you know, thank you for having me, and I just hope sort of, you know, readers enjoy the book and the podcast.
So that brings us to the end of this week's Runners World podcast. A huge thanks to our guest, Rachel Hewitt, and to you, of course, for listening.
You can subscribe to 3 issues of Runners World for just £5. Head to runnersworld.com/UK/podcast offer to get that exclusive listener offer. Please continue to listen to the Runners World podcast wherever you're listening to it right now. And if you haven't subscribed, then just do that. Tell everyone else who likes running or perhaps doesn't like running yet to listen to this podcast. And that's probably all that you need to do right now. So just tune in again next week.